He gave the most celebrated lectures on Zen Buddhism in the Western world. He wrote 17 books on consciousness, presence, and the nature of the self. He described the experience of being fully alive with a precision and beauty that made rooms fall silent. He was also, by his own admission, a fraud. Not the ordinary kind. Not a man who pretended to believe things he didn't. Alan Watts believed every word he ever said. He understood the Tao more clearly than almost any Western mind of the 20th century. He could describe the watercourse way, the effortless movement of a life aligned with its own nature, with a clarity that left his audiences breathless. He just couldn't live it. Not consistently. Not in the way that mattered most. Not at the Houseboat in Sausalito where the wine was always open. Not in the 3 marriages that each began in genuine love and ended in the same pattern of withdrawal. Not in the gap, which he talked about constantly, publicly, with unusual honesty, between what he knew and what he was. And here's the thing that will take this entire video to fully understand. That gap was not his failure. It was his most important teaching. I'm Andrew, and this is Daily Tao Wisdom, where we go back to the source. Not the quotes on Instagram, not the self-help repackaging, the actual stories, the actual figures, the actual wisdom, and what it means for your life right now. In our last video, Jung versus Watts, one had the map, the other had the method. We ended with a question. Watts had the method. He could describe effortless living with extraordinary precision. But what happened when the man who understood Wu Wei better than anyone couldn't practice it himself? By the end of this video, you will understand why Alan Watts's personal failures were not a contradiction of his philosophy. They were its most honest demonstration. And you will never look at the gap between what you know and how you live the same way again. The year is 1969, Sausalito, California. A converted ferry boat called the Vallejo sits moored in Richardson Bay, 40 minutes north of San Francisco. It is, by any measure, a remarkable place to live. The bay at night is still and dark. The lights of the city reflect in the water. Inside the boat, shelves of books, a phonograph playing Ravi Shankar, and a man sitting in his study with a glass of scotch, preparing tomorrow's lecture. The man is 54 years old. In 12 years, he will be dead. His name is Alan Wilson Watts, and he is, at this exact moment, one of the most influential philosophers in America, which is an unusual thing to be in a country that has never quite agreed that philosophy is useful. He has spent the last 2 decades doing something no one had attempted before him at anything like this scale, translating the wisdom of the East into language that the Western mind could actually receive, not adapt it, not domesticate it, not turn it into a self-help program or a meditation app or a weekend retreat. Translate it with full fidelity to its strangeness, its difficulty, its refusal to be comfortable. He has given this work everything. The lectures at the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, the radio broadcasts on KPFA Berkeley that people still describe as the closest thing to hearing an ancient text speak in a modern voice, the 17 books, the recordings that will eventually number in the hundreds and will still be listened to 50 years after his death by people who feel, correctly, that he is saying something nobody else is saying. He has given the work everything, and the work has taken things in return. 3 marriages. The first to Eleanor Everett, daughter of a Zen Buddhist teacher, dissolved when his restlessness outgrew the structure of their life together. The second to Dorothy DeWitt, ended in the same pattern, the same slow withdrawal into his own interior world. The third to Mary Jane Yates, who will outlive him, who will describe the life they shared on the houseboat with genuine warmth and genuine sadness in equal measure. The drinking, not hidden, not denied. Watts talked about it openly, which was unusual for the era, and more unusual still for a man whose public identity was built on the philosophy of effortless living. He drank heavily, consistently, for most of his adult life. The scotch in the study was not a portrait detail, it was a fixture. The contradiction between what he taught and how he lived was not lost on him. He was the first to name it. In conversations with students, in letters to colleagues, in the late-night sessions on the houseboat where the formal lecture was over and something more honest was being said, he returned to it again and again. "I am," he told a student who later published the exchange, "a genuine fraud." The student asked what he meant. "I mean," Watts said, "that everything I tell you is true, and I am living proof that knowing the truth is not the same as living it." To understand what Watts meant, and why this admission is more philosophically significant than it first appears, you have to understand what he was actually teaching, not the surface version, not the go with the flow misreading that drove him to fury in his later years. The real version, the one that begins with a specific question about what you actually are. Here is the question Alan Watts spent his entire career asking, not because he didn't know the answer, because he knew that the question itself, properly heard, was the beginning of everything. What are you? Not what is your name. Not what do you do. Not what do you believe. What are you? This specific experience of being here, now, looking out through these eyes, aware of these thoughts, sitting in this particular moment that has never existed before and will never exist again? Western culture has a ready answer. You are a self, a separate individual, an entity that begins at your skin and ends there. Everything inside the skin is you. Everything outside is not you. You arrived in this world through no choice of your own. You will be here briefly. While you are here, your primary task is to maintain and improve the entity, to survive, to achieve, to protect the boundary between what is you and what is not. Watts called this the skin-encapsulated ego, and he spent 30 years arguing, with considerable wit and no small amount of frustration, that it was not a fact about reality. It was a story, a very old story, told so consistently and begun so early in every Western life that we had stopped noticing it was a story and started mistaking it for the shape of things. You know this feeling, not as a philosophical idea, as an experience. The persistent sense that you are slightly separate from your own life, that there is a gap between you and the present moment that you cannot quite close, that you are watching your life from a slight remove, as if through glass, rather than simply living it. That gap, the one you've felt since childhood, the one that therapy and meditation and philosophy and the occasional glass of wine all promise to close, has a name in Watts' framework. He called it the illusion of the separate self. And the Tao Te Ching, he said, was the most precise description ever written of what happens when the illusion drops. But here's where the story gets specific, because Watts didn't just describe the illusion, he described what he saw on the other side of it. And it was something that neither Western psychology nor Western religion had ever quite managed to articulate. In our video, Carl Jung read the Tao Te Ching. It broke his theory of the mind. We traced what happened when the most rigorous psychologist of the 20th century encountered Lao Tzu's first paragraph and felt the floor of his system shift beneath him. Jung saw the Tao as a destination, something you arrived at after years of the excavation work he called individuation. The shadow-faced, the unconscious integrated, the self-assembled piece by difficult piece until finally, at the end of the long labor, something whole emerged. Watts read the same text and saw something different, not a destination, a recognition. The Tao, in Watts's reading, was not at the end of any journey. It was what the journey was happening inside of. It was not the reward for doing the psychological work. It was the ground the work was standing on. It was, and this is the sentence that made his audiences go quiet in a different way from any other sentence he spoke. What you already are, before you started trying to become anything. Chapter 16 of the Tao Te Ching, Return to the Root. This is called stillness. Stillness is the return to one's destiny. Watts read this not as an instruction, but as a description. You do not return to stillness by achieving it. You return by recognizing that you never actually left. The river does not try to reach the ocean. It is always already moving toward wherever is lower, following the path of least resistance, and it arrives without having decided to arrive. You are, Watts said, more like the river than you think. And the distance between your current experience and the experience of the river is not a distance that effort can close, because effort is precisely what maintains it. This sounds abstract. It isn't. Think about the last time you were genuinely, unself-consciously absorbed in something. A conversation that became so real, the self-monitoring stopped. A piece of work that demanded everything and gave back something you didn't know you had. A moment so present that the observer, the part of you that stands slightly behind your experience, watching it, judging it, deciding whether you're doing it right, simply wasn't there. That wasn't a spiritual achievement. That was your natural state, briefly unobstructed. Watts called it the watercourse way, not a practice, not a technique, the way awareness moves when it's not fighting itself. And then something happened that nobody expected. Watts found a text that described this state with a precision that went beyond anything he had written himself, and it was 2,000 years old. In 1929, the same year Carl Jung read the Tao Te Ching for the first time, Richard Wilhelm published a German translation of an ancient Chinese Taoist text called The Secret of the Golden Flower. As we explored in the Jung versus Watts video, Jung wrote the foreword for that translation and called it the most accurate description of what he was watching happen in his most healed patients. Watts read the same text 15 years later and had a completely different response. Jung had read it as confirmation, evidence that his own framework was pointing in the right direction. The circulation of the light, the central practice of the text, confirmed for him that the transcendent function he had observed in patients was real, cross-culturally documented, and therefore valid. Watts read it as instruction, not confirmation of a theory, not validation of a framework, direct practical instruction in what to actually do, or more precisely, what to actually stop doing in any given moment of ordinary life. The circulation of the light is not a meditation technique in the sense the modern wellness industry uses that phrase. It is a description of what awareness does when it stops fixating, when it neither grasps the pleasant nor rejects the unpleasant, when it neither forces an outcome nor runs from what's present. It is, Watts pointed out with considerable emphasis, what your awareness is already doing in every moment that you are genuinely alive without self-consciousness. The child playing, the craftsman at full capacity, the conversation that forgets to be performance, the grief that stops fighting itself and simply moves. In all of these moments, the light is circulating, not because someone achieved it, because no one interrupted it. Watts spent the 1950s developing this insight into the clearest articulation of Wu Wei in the Western tradition. The wisdom of insecurity, written in one sustained burst of clarity on the Sausalito houseboat in 1951, in the wreckage of his priestly career and his first marriage, remains to this day the most precise description of Taoist presence in the English language. The book does not argue. It does not systematize. It does not offer a method. It simply points at the experience you are having right now. The experience of being alive without a fixed, stable self at the center. And it says, this is not a problem to be solved. This is the actual nature of things. The instability you are trying to escape is the Tao moving. But here's what most people miss about this moment. The book that most clearly described effortless living was written by a man in the middle of what he later described as his most effortful period. And that tension never fully resolved. Alan Watts understood the gap between knowing and living better than almost anyone who ever wrote about it. He understood it theoretically, as the precise structure of the skin-encapsulated ego's inability to step outside itself. And he understood it personally, from the inside, as the specific experience of knowing exactly what was happening and being unable to stop it anyway. The drinking continued. The marriages continued their pattern. The withdrawal into the interior world, the lectures, the recordings, the books, the private study where the scotch was always present, continued to create distance between him and the people who tried to be close to him. People who knew him well describe a specific quality of presence he had in a lecture hall or in a conversation with a stranger, an absolute, luminous, completely unself-conscious attention that could dissolve the moment he was with someone who loved him and therefore needed something from him. He was more present with 500 people than with one. He knew this. He said so. He returned to it in conversations throughout his life, with the kind of honest curiosity that makes his self-examination more valuable than most people's self-improvement. I keep discovering, he told a journalist in 1971, that I am the last person equipped to live what I teach, which may be why I keep teaching it. It is what I most need to hear. This is not a confession of failure. It is a philosophical observation of extraordinary precision. Because what Watts was describing, without quite naming it in these terms, is the central paradox of Taoist practice as it actually unfolds in a human life. Not in theory, in the specific, inconvenient, non-linear reality of trying to live wisdom in a body that has its own history, its own wounds, its own patterns of seeking comfort and avoiding pain. The Tao Te Ching knows this paradox. Chapter 70. My words are very easy to understand and very easy to practice, yet no one in the world can understand them or practice them. Lao Tzu was not being modest. He was being precise. The words are easy. The understanding is accessible. The practice, the actual moment-by-moment living of what you understand, requires something that understanding alone cannot provide. What does it require? This is the question Watts spent his last decade sitting with. And the answer he arrived at is the most honest thing he ever said about the relationship between knowledge and transformation. And then something happened that nobody expected, because the answer was not a method, and it was not a surrender. It was something that can only be described as a third thing, something the Western tradition doesn't have a clean word for. By the late 1960s, Alan Watts had developed what his students called his honest talk, a mode of conversation that happened after the formal lecture was over, in the smaller rooms, in the late-night sessions on the Houseboat, where the performance had been set aside and something more dangerous was being said. In these conversations, he returned again and again to what he called the sincere fraud. A sincere fraud, he explained once to a small group on the Vallejo, is not someone who pretends to believe what they don't. That is an ordinary fraud. A sincere fraud is someone who genuinely believes what they say, knows that their life doesn't match it, and keeps saying it anyway. Not out of hypocrisy, but out of a conviction that the truth needs to be spoken even by people who haven't managed to live it yet. He paused. Someone poured more wine. Most spiritual teachers, he continued, solve this problem by constructing a persona of having arrived, of being, in some relevant sense, beyond the struggle they are describing. This is efficient. It gives the students a model to aspire to. It makes the teacher feel safer, and it is, in my experience, almost always a lie. The room was quiet. "I am," he said, "a sincere fraud. I know the water. I know exactly how the water moves. I can describe it better than almost anyone alive. And I frequently fight the current. Not because I don't know better, because knowing better and doing better are two different problems. And the Tao, to its credit, has never promised that solving one solves the other." This is not a failure of character. This is a philosophical position. And it is, I would argue, the most Taoist thing Alan Watts ever said. Because the Tao Te Ching does not promise that the sage is someone who has conquered their contradictions. The sage, in Lao Tzu's description, is someone who holds their contradictions without needing them to be resolved, who acts without forcing, who teaches without claiming a rival, who is, in Chapter 22's precise language, bent but whole, crooked but straight, empty but full. The sincere fraud is not the opposite of the Taoist sage. He is its most honest Western embodiment. But here's where the story gets stranger. Because toward the end of his life, Watts began to see something in his own contradictions that went beyond honest self-awareness. Something that was actually, in the Taoist sense, useful. (1972). Alan Watts is 57 years old. He has 1 year left to live, though he doesn't know it. He is recording a series of lectures that will be released after his death under the title Tao, the Watercourse Way. His final and in some ways most complete attempt to describe in Western language what Lao Tzu described in 81 poems. In the recordings, something has changed. Not the quality of the thought, not the precision of the language, something in the relationship between the speaker and what he is saying. A quality of, there is no better word for it, settledness, not arrived, not resolved, settled, the way water settles into the shape of whatever contains it, without pretending to be something other than water. He talks about his own failures differently in these recordings, not with the slightly performative self-deprecation of the earlier work. I am a fraud, what can I say? But with something quieter, more genuinely curious, as if he has begun to find his contradictions interesting rather than embarrassing. He says, in one of these final recordings, something that I have returned to more times than I can count. I have spent 40 years trying to understand why I cannot live what I know, and I have recently begun to suspect that this is not a problem to be solved, but a koan to be inhabited. The gap between knowing and living is not a failure of the practice. It is the practice. The water does not arrive at the ocean and then stop being water. It keeps moving. And wherever it is, even when it is muddy, even when it is frozen, even when it is fighting the stone, it is still entirely water. This is the statement that contains everything. Not, I have achieved the watercourse way. Not, I have failed the watercourse way. Something older and more honest than either. I am the watercourse way, including the parts that don't look like it. The Tao Te Ching opens with its most famous line. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. What comes next in chapter 1 is less often quoted. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. Alan Watts spent 40 years naming. The skin-encapsulated ego, the watercourse way, the game of black and white, the sincere fraud. He named with extraordinary precision and beauty, and he could not stop fighting the current, and he kept naming anyway. And the naming, the decades of pointing at the water with a precision that made rooms fall silent, was itself a form of flowing. Not the whole of it, not the easy part, but water. Here's what most people miss about the final chapter of Alan Watts's life. It's not the drinking or the houseboat or the lectures that defines it. It's what he was working toward and what he left unfinished. Tao, The Watercourse Way was published in 1975. Watts had been working on it for years and died before it was complete. The final chapters were assembled from his notes by his collaborator, Al Chung-Liang Huang. The book is the clearest bridge between Carl Jung's world and Lao Tzu's world ever written. It is also, unmistakably, the work of a man who has stopped performing and started simply thinking on the page. The central concept Watts returns to again and again, more than Wu Wei, more than the water principle, more than any of the ideas he had made famous in previous decades, is te, virtue, not in the moral sense, in the ancient sense, the sense the word held before Christian ethics reshaped it into obedience and goodness. Te, as the inherent power of a thing, the natural excellence that emerges when something is fully what it is, the force that doesn't announce itself. A river has tea. A tree has tea. A human being, when they are not busy performing the human being they think they are supposed to be, has tea. And here is the thing about tea that Watts understood in his final years with a clarity that the earlier work, for all its brilliance, had not quite reached. Tea is not achieved. It is not the reward for spiritual practice or psychological work or years of meditation or the courage to face your shadow. It is what remains when you stop doing those things badly, when you stop doing them as performances of becoming rather than genuine acts of inquiry. You cannot manufacture tea. You can only remove what is blocking it. And what blocks it? Watts's answer in the final recordings is the most honest answer he ever gave to any question. The thing that blocks tea, he says, is the belief that you need to become something other than what you are in order to have it, which is precisely the belief that the skin-encapsulated ego is built on. The ego does not block tea by being evil or ignorant or spiritually undeveloped. It blocks tea by being convinced that tea is something to be acquired rather than something to be recognized. He paused for a long time in the recording. You can hear the bay outside the houseboat window, a boat moving, water. I have spent 40 years pointing at Te, he said finally, and I notice that I still, regularly, try to acquire it, which is probably why I keep pointing. I know this is a long one. Stay with me, because what comes next is where everything we've covered today becomes something you can actually use, not as a theory, as a move you can make today. Alan Watts died on November 16, 1973. He was 58 years old. He was found peacefully in his sleep in his cabin on the Vallejo. The scotch was presumably nearby. The books were definitely there. The bay was where it always was. He left behind 17 books, hundreds of recordings, and one question so precisely framed that it has outlasted every answer anyone has tried to give it. If knowing the truth is not the same as living the truth, what is the relationship between them? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the central unresolved problem of every serious philosophical tradition in human history. The Confucians called it the gap between learning and action. The Jungians called it the distance between insight and integration. The Buddhists called it the difference between intellectual understanding and direct realization. Lao Tzu, as usual, was more precise than any of them. Chapter 71. Knowing that you do not know is best. Not knowing that you do not know is sickness. Watts's contribution to this ancient problem was not a solution. It was something more valuable, an honest map of the territory that includes the mapmaker's own location. He was in the gap. He knew he was in the gap. He refused to pretend he had crossed it. And from that position, that specific, uncomfortable, honest position, he described the other side with greater clarity than most people who claim to have arrived there. The sincere fraud, it turns out, may be the most trustworthy guide. Not because he has the answers, because he has stopped lying about the questions. What this actually means for your life. I know what you are thinking. This is extraordinary. A man of genuine genius who could not live his own philosophy, finding peace with that contradiction in his final recordings, leaving behind a question that nobody has fully answered in 2,500 years. And you have a specific gap in your own life. The thing you know you should do and don't. The pattern you understand completely and keep running anyway. The version of yourself you can describe with precision and cannot seem to inhabit consistently. So let's be concrete. 3 specific things you can do with what Watts discovered. Application 1. Stop treating the gap as evidence of failure. The most common response to the gap between knowing and living is to treat it as proof that something is wrong with you, that you haven't done enough therapy, haven't meditated enough, haven't integrated enough shadow material, haven't understood the thing deeply enough yet. Watts's life is a counter-argument to this entire framing. He understood the thing more deeply than almost anyone alive. The gap remained, not because his understanding was insufficient, because the gap is not a knowledge problem. It is the structure of being human in a body that has its own history, its own biochemistry, its own deeply grooved patterns of seeking comfort and avoiding pain. The gap is not a symptom of spiritual inadequacy. It is the Koan. What changes when you stop treating it as a failure? Not the gap. The gap stays. What changes is the quality of your relationship to it. And that quality, the difference between fighting the current and flowing through the same water, is precisely what tea is. Try this today. The next time you notice the gap, the moment when you see yourself doing the thing you know you shouldn't, or not doing the thing you know you should, instead of adding the layer of self-criticism that usually follows, simply notice it. Not with acceptance as a performance, with the genuine curiosity of someone who finds their own contradictions interesting rather than shameful. That is not giving up. That is, in Watt's precise language, letting the work work. Application 2. Speak the truth you haven't lived. Yet Watts continued to teach what he could not consistently practice. Not out of hypocrisy, he was too honest for that, but out of the conviction that the truth needs to be articulated even by people who haven't mastered it. This is a radical permission. Most people wait until they have lived something before they speak it, until they have solved the pattern before they name it, until they have crossed the gap before they describe the other side. This produces a specific kind of silence, the silence of people who know what needs to be said and are waiting for the credentials to say it. Watts's life argues against this waiting. The wisdom of insecurity was written in the wreckage of two failed institutions, his marriage and his priesthood. The watercourse way was completed posthumously from notes made by a man who still drank too much. The recordings that have changed more lives than he ever counted were made by someone who described himself as the last person equipped to live what he taught. The truth you have seen but not yet consistently lived is still the truth. Speaking it is not fraud. It is, in the Taoist sense, pointing at the moon, and the fact that your finger is imperfect does not make the moon less real. Application 3. Find the T in what you already are in the final recordings. Watts kept returning to T, not as something to achieve, as something to recognize. Here is the practice he was pointing at, stripped to its simplest form. For 1 minute today, not for a lifetime of practice, for 1 minute, stop trying to improve the person you are and simply notice what is already functioning. The breathing that happens without your management, the heartbeat that doesn't require your supervision, the fact that you are reading these words and understanding them without consciously constructing the understanding. Something is working, something is already flowing, something in you already knows how to be water. Te is not the reward for getting this right. Te is what you already have when you stop insisting that you don't have it yet. Watts knew this. He said it better than anyone. He also poured another scotch. And he kept saying it, which is, when you think about it, its own form of flowing. If this channel has become the place you come to think through the questions that actually matter, subscribe. We go this deep every week. And drop a comment with this. Are you a sincere fraud about anything? Not in the negative sense, in Watts' sense. Is there a truth you keep speaking that you haven't fully managed to live yet? I'm genuinely curious, because Watts would say the answer to that question tells you more about where your real work is than any assessment you could do. Let's go back to Sausalito, 1969. The Vallejo moored in Richardson Bay, a man with a glass of scotch preparing tomorrow's lecture on the effortless life. We see him differently now, not as a hypocrite, not as a saint, not as a cautionary tale about the gap between philosophy and practice. As a man who spent his entire life pointing at something real, with extraordinary precision, with genuine beauty, with more honesty about his own failures than almost any teacher of his generation, and who found, in his final years, that the pointing itself was a form of arriving. The river does not need to reach the ocean to be the river. It is already flowing. The flowing is the whole of it. Alan Watts left one question unanswered, not because he ran out of time, though he did, but because it is, by nature, unanswerable in the way that questions about the Tao are unanswerable, not because they have no answer, but because the answer is not the kind that can be handed from one person to another. The question is this: if the gap between knowing and living is not a failure, but a koan, if the sincere fraud is the most honest position available to a human being who has genuinely seen the water, then what would it mean to stop fighting the gap and start inhabiting it? Not as a resignation, as a practice. Spend one evening this week finding out. Not by trying to cross the gap, by sitting in it, honestly, with the curiosity Watts eventually found for his own contradictions. That is the practice he was describing all along. He just needed 40 years and a houseboat and a great deal of scotch to say it that simply. The next video in this series goes somewhere Watts and Jung both pointed toward, but neither fully explored. To a man who stared into the void of European civilization, declared God dead, and found, at the bottom of that darkness, something that looked remarkably like the Tao. Friedrich Nietzsche read Schopenhauer, who had read the Upanishads, who had read, though this is never discussed, texts that trace directly to Lao Tzu. The connection is not academic. It is personal, strange, and completely untold. Stay curious. Stay still. This is daily Tao wisdom. The rest is yours.